The baby was left on Adaize Okafor's porch at 4:17 a.m. on a Thursday in November, wrapped in a man's white dress shirt with a monogram on the left cuff she couldn't read until the sun came up. She had heard the engine of a car she didn't recognize idling on Mensa Close for 3 minutes before the sound dissolved into the dark. When she opened her door, she thought it might be the stray she had been leaving water out for. It was not the stray. The boy was 6 days old by the weight of him. She knew 6 days old the way she knew the sound of rain before it reached the roof. She had delivered 7 babies in her career as a community midwife in cantonments, Accra, and she had held all of them at every age from first breath forward. She stood on the porch step in her wrapper and her house slippers, and she looked left and right down the empty street, and the only thing moving was a plastic sachet bag caught in the low branch of the neem tree outside her gate. She took the baby inside. She did not call the police until 7 a.m., and by then she had already fed him twice, using the emergency formula she kept in the third cabinet, because 6 months earlier her neighbor's daughter had delivered early, and the clinic on the Tama motorway had run out of stock. The police came at 9:14 a.m., a constable and a corporal, both younger than her youngest son. They wrote things down. They told her she would hear from the social welfare office within 5 business days. She did not hear from the social welfare office within 5 business days. She did not hear from them within 5 weeks. She named the boy Tobena, which in Igbo means the father's name lives on, though she did not know the father's name, and she thought there was something honest in the contradiction. Adaize Eduke Okafor was 54 years old and 61 kilograms, though she had been 68 kilograms before her husband Emmanuel died of a cardiac arrest at the bus station at Kwame Nkrumah Circle on a Monday morning 3 years earlier. The weight she had lost in those 3 years had not come back. She had stopped cooking full meals for herself and started cooking full meals for the neighborhood. The widow at the end of the road who could not manage stairs anymore. The boy from the compound next door whose mother worked nights at the packaging factory on the industrial estate. She wore, most days, a faded green dress with white trim that she had sewn herself from fabric she bought at Makola Market in 2019 for 32 cedis. The seams were still tight. She was careful with things. She had kept Emmanuel's wristwatch in the drawer beside her bed, a Seiko with a cracked crystal, and a steel bracelet worn smooth on the inside where it had rested against his skin for 27 years of marriage. She did not wear it. She took it out in the evenings sometimes and held it in her palm with the face up, not checking the time because the battery had been dead since the month after his funeral, just holding it the way you hold something that was touched by someone you could not hold anymore. When Tobena cried at night, she set the watch on the table, beside the mattress on the floor, where she laid him, in the space between the bed and the wall, because she did not want him to fall, and because she wanted something of Emmanuel's nearby, even if Emmanuel had never met this child, and never would. She was a midwife with 31 years of practice, certified by the Nursing and Midwifery Council of Ghana, known across the cantonments and Osu areas as the woman who came when the hospitals turned people away at the gate. She had delivered babies in the back seats of taxis, on kitchen floors, in a church pew once during a rainstorm that had turned every road in the neighborhood into a river. She knew what a human body needed when it arrived in the world. What she did not know was what would happen when the social welfare office finally responded, or whether the monogram on the white shirt, which she had read as the letters K and A, intertwined, would ever mean anything to anyone who might come looking. She reported this to no one, because no one had come to receive the report. She settled into the structure of caring for Tobena the way she had settled into everything else the last 3 years, methodically, without announcement. Because the work was the work, whether or not anyone observed it. By the time Tobena was 7 months old, He had begun to smile the way babies smile when something in the air changes before they understand why. Adeze had noted that he smiled most often in the early morning, when the light came low and orange through the louvres of the front room, and she had begun leaving the curtains at a specific angle to extend that light by 8 or 9 minutes every day. She did not name this habit to herself. She simply did it. The neighbors knew. In Mensah Close, neighbors always knew. Auntie Celia from the beige house 2 doors down had come by with a bag of Cerelac and a look on her face that was not quite a question, and not quite approval, and not quite disapproval either. Adeze had thanked her for the Cerelac and offered her tea and told her the whole story across the kitchen table, the same table where Emmanuel used to sit and read the graphic in the mornings. Auntie Celia had said, "Adeze, you know the world will talk." And Adeze had said, "Yes, I know." The tea was getting cold, and she lifted her cup and drank it. The world talked. The assistant pastor's wife at the church on Osu Oxford Street told a version of the story that included a lover Adeze had never had and a scandalous origin she had entirely invented. 3 women from the market stopped buying their provisions from the shop at the corner, because the shopkeeper, whose cousin was the corporal who had come on the first morning, had spread a quieter and equally inaccurate version. None of this reached Adeze until Auntie Celia reported it to her 3 months later, by which time Tobena was 10 months old and pulling himself upright against the back of the sofa and regarding the world from this new height, with the focused seriousness of a person who has recently arrived at a position they intend to maintain. Adeze looked at the boy standing against the sofa and thought, let them talk. She went back to work when Tobena was 4 months old, because the pension from Emmanuel's years at the Transport Authority had not been processed correctly, and the amount deposited into her account on the first of every month was 163 cedi short of what the paperwork said it should be. And the Transport Authority's Human Resources Department had been correcting this error for 11 months without resolving it. She took Tobena with her to her morning home visits, strapped against her chest in the wrapper she had folded and tied the way her own mother had taught her in their compound in Enugu in 1978. The mothers she visited noticed the boy and did not always ask, and she did not always explain, and this produced a kind of mutual privacy she found she was grateful for. It was during one of these morning visits that she met Mama Vivian. Mama Vivian was 79 years old, slight as a blade of grass in a dry season, and she sat every morning from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. on the wooden bench outside the gate of the cream-colored house on Cantonments Road where she had lived since 1988. She was not a patient. She was simply there, in the way that certain people become part of the furniture of a street, present and weather-worn and observing. She had watched Adeze walk past that gate for 11 years. She began, in the months after Tobena arrived, to watch differently. One morning in February, when Tobena was 14 months old and walking now with the determined unsteadiness of the recently mobile, Mama Vivian called out to Adeze from her bench and said, "Come and sit for 1 minute." Adeze sat. Tobena stood between her knees and examined the crack in the concrete path with the concentration of a civil engineer. Mama Vivian looked at the boy for a long time. She said, slowly, as though reading from something written down inside her, "That child has a mark above his left ear, like a small crescent." She paused. "I have seen that mark before." Adeze looked at the mark above Tobena's left ear, which she had noticed at his first bath and had thought was a birthmark, and had not mentioned to anyone because it seemed like private information about a person too small to have decided who to share it with. She said, "Where have you seen it?" Mama Vivian looked down the road toward the Tema motorway and said nothing for 45 seconds. Then she said, "Come back tomorrow." Alone, If this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest, stay with me. What Mama Vivian said the next morning changes everything that came before it. Adeze came back the next morning alone, at 6:22 a.m., with a small flask of tea she had made from ginger and honey, because Mama Vivian had mentioned once that her joints troubled her in the harmattan. They sat on the bench together, and Mama Vivian took the tea and held it in both hands, and did not drink it immediately, just let the warmth move into her palms. And then she said, "I used to work in this house for a family, the Owusu Boateng family. The father was a man named Kwame Owusu Boateng. He was a kind man. He had a son, also Kwame, the junior, and the son grew into a man who built something large, technology, international. I don't know the full of it. I stopped working here in 2011 when my hip became what it is. But I know that the younger Kwame, I heard he lost his wife. A young woman. She was pregnant when she died. A road accident, somewhere outside Abuja. I heard this from Celia, from down the road. She heard it from her sister who attends the Legon church." Mama Vivian turned the flask in her hands. "That was about 2 years before you found the child." She looked at Adeze, the crescent mark above the ear. "It is on the father's family. I bathed young Kwame as a baby. That mark was on his ear too." Adeze sat with this for 3 full minutes. A bus went past on Cantonments Road. Tobena was at home with Auntie Celia, who had begun coming on Tuesday and Thursday mornings without being asked. The harmattan had thinned the air to the particular clarity that only came in those dry months, and every sound carried further than it should, so that she could hear 2 men arguing at a fuel station a full block away and make out individual words. She said to Mama Vivian, "Do you know how to find him?" Mama Vivian said, "I know the house. The family house in East Legon is still standing. I know it is because Celia's niece does the cleaning there. But the son, the younger Kwame, he is not in Ghana. He is not often in Ghana. He has been, I think, not himself since the wife died. That is what I have heard. A man who has money and grief in equal measure goes very far to carry them separately." Adeze walked home on a road she had walked 10,000 times, and she thought about the word separately. She thought about Emmanuel's watch in the drawer, and whether she had ever carried her grief and her money separately, or whether they had always moved together. Indistinguishable. That afternoon she wrote a letter. She was a woman who believed in letters the way some people believed in prayer. Which is to say, she believed that the act of writing was also the act of thinking clearly, and that thinking clearly was a form of respect you paid to serious matters. She wrote 4 drafts across 2 evenings at the kitchen table, by the light of the standing lamp Emmanuel had bought at the Thursday market in 2014. And each draft was shorter than the one before. The final letter was 1 page, handwritten, with no decoration. It stated the date the child was left. It described the white shirt and the monogram. It described the crescent mark. It said, "I do not know who you are, but I believe you may know who he is. I have cared for him for 14 months. He is well. He is loved. Whatever you decide, he will continue to be cared for. My name is Adeze Okafor, formerly of Enugu, now of Mensa Close, Cantonments, Accra. I am a midwife. I do not need anything from you. But I thought you should know, he is here." She gave the letter to Celia's niece, whose name was Portia, to deliver to the house in East Legon. Portia delivered it to the caretaker of the house on a Friday afternoon. What happened to the letter between the caretaker's hands and Kwame Owusu Boateng Jr.'s hands on the other side of whatever ocean he was standing beside, Adeze did not know. She went back to her work. She took Tobena to his wellness check at the clinic on Wednesday morning. She repaired the fence at the back of the yard where the wood had rotted through and let the wind touch things it shouldn't touch. She waited, and she was not certain she was waiting, because she had trained herself in the 3 years since Emmanuel died not to lean toward anything that had not yet arrived. It arrived on a Tuesday at 11:09 a.m., though not in the form she might have imagined if she had been the kind of woman who imagined forms. The sound came before the sight. A low thrum that was different from the commercial flight paths she had grown used to, lower and more deliberate, the sound of something that was not following a corridor but choosing one. Tobena heard it first. He was in the yard with a red plastic bowl he had claimed from the kitchen, for reasons only he understood, filling it methodically with pebbles and then dumping them and starting again. And he stopped and looked up with his particular serious face, the one he wore when something required investigation. Then Adize, at the kitchen window, heard it too. The jet was small by the standards of the things that landed at Kotoka, but it was not small by the standards of Mensa Close, and it did not land at Kotoka. It descended over the waste ground behind the row of houses, the flat stretch that the community had been arguing about for 4 years, because some people wanted a football pitch, and the district assembly had promised and not delivered. And it came down on that flat stretch with a precision that said this had been arranged in advance, that someone had checked the dimensions and confirmed the clearance and spoken to someone who spoke to someone, and that all of that had happened without Adize knowing any of it. She dried her hands on the cloth by the sink. She walked to the yard. She picked Tobena up from beside his bowl of pebbles without saying anything and held him on her hip, and they stood at the back gate and watched the jet settle and go still. The door opened. A man came down the steps. He was tall, 188 centimeters or close to it, wearing a white shirt untucked over dark trousers, and he had no jacket despite the harmattan, and he looked like a man who had not slept in a time he had stopped counting. He walked across the waste ground with the same deliberateness the jet had used to descend, not hurrying, not hesitating, placing each step like he was reading the ground for information. Behind him came a woman in a gray blazer with a tablet in her hands, and behind her a younger man carrying a briefcase. But the tall man had already arrived alone at Adize's gate before either of the others had cleared the shadow of the jet. He stopped at the gate. He looked at her. He looked at Tobena on her hip. His face did not change in any way she could name with a single word, but she watched him go completely still. The stillness of a man who has just received a piece of information he has been trying not to hope for, and suddenly cannot continue not hoping. He said, "Mrs. Okafor." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm Kwame." She said, "I know." Tobena looked at the man at the gate with the focused seriousness of a child who has been looking at the world from one angle for 2 years, and is now seeing something that reorganizes the angle. The crescent mark above his left ear was visible from where Kwame stood. Adize watched Kwame see it. She watched his right hand grip the gatepost, just briefly, and then release. She opened the gate. She made tea because it was the thing she did when something serious was happening. The same way she had made tea the morning the police came. The same way she had brought the flask to Mama Vivian's bench. She set Tobena down on the kitchen floor with the red plastic bowl, because familiarity was its own form of steadiness, and she wanted the boy to have something steady. Kwame sat at Emmanuel's table. The woman in the gray blazer stood near the door with her tablet against her chest and her eyes down. The younger man waited outside. Nobody had told him to wait outside. He had simply understood. Kwame said, "I need to explain to you what happened." Adize said, "You don't need to explain anything to me." He said, "My wife." Her name was Nana. She was 8 months pregnant when she died. The accident was in October. between Abuja and Suleja. The baby survived. The doctors told me there was a possibility of complications, serious ones, long-term, and I was not in a condition to. He stopped. He put both hands flat on the table. He was not in a condition to be a father, was the end of the sentence. But he did not finish it, because the end of it was already clear, and because the table was between them, and the table had heard Emmanuel, and it would not be disturbed. She said, "He doesn't have any complications. He is healthy. He hit every milestone at the right time. His appetite is good. He sleeps through from about 9 p.m. He likes pebbles and he likes the color red, and he doesn't like sudden loud sounds, but he never cries without a reason." Kwame looked at Tobena on the floor, who had emptied the red bowl and was now refilling it with measured concentration. He said, very quietly, "I was wrong. I know that. I have known it since the morning after I left him. I have not been able to undo knowing it." Adeze said, "Drink your tea." He drank his tea. The woman in the gray blazer stepped forward and said, with the professional gentleness of someone who had been trained to deliver large amounts of information in a human voice, that she was the director of the Owusu Boateng Family Foundation, and that Mr. Owusu Boateng had instructed her to formalize Adeze's role as primary caregiver in any legal arrangement they arrived at today, and that there was a figure. She named a figure in cedis that was the equivalent of $38,000, a retroactive accounting for 2 years and 3 months of care at professional midwife plus primary caregiver rates, that Mr. Owusu Boateng wished to transfer immediately, and that there was also a proposal for ongoing involvement in Tobena's life that she could walk through in detail if Mrs. Okafor was willing to hear it. Adeze looked at the director, and then looked at Kwame, and then looked at Tobena on the floor with his bowl and his pebbles. She said, "I don't need the money." She paused. "But the money matters, and I'll take it, because Tobena should understand later that his care was valued and recorded." She paused again. "What I need to know is whether you are coming back into his life as his father, or whether you are coming back to arrange his life from a distance, because those are different things, and he will feel the difference before he can name it." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of pebbles going into the bowl. Kwame said, "I'm coming back." She looked at him for 7 seconds. She said, "Then come back." The legal arrangements took 11 days and were handled by a solicitor from Accra who drove a white Nissan Pathfinder and wore a wig to every meeting that nobody commented on. The arrangement gave Kwame full parental responsibility and gave Adeze a formally recognized caregiving role that would continue at whatever level she and Kwame agreed was right for Tobena as he grew. The 38,000 cedis became the foundation of a small account in Tobena's name, and a second amount deposited into Adeze's account on a morning in March when the Harmattan had finally broken and the air smelled of rain coming from the south. The Owusu Boateng family house in East Legon was 7 kilometers from Mensa Close. Kwame began coming on Saturdays. He sat on the kitchen floor with Tobena and the red plastic bowl, the same way Tobena sat, at the same height, and let the boy establish the rules of the pebble arrangement, which changed every week and which Tobena enforced with absolute consistency for the duration of each session. Kwame observed these rules without requiring them to be explained. Adeze watched from the kitchen window and thought about the way her own children had taught her things she could not have learned any other way. By the time Tobena was 3 years old, Kwame was coming on Wednesdays and Saturdays and sometimes on Sunday mornings, and the flat land behind Mensa Close where the jet had landed had, by some mechanism of the district assembly that nobody fully understood, been leveled and fenced and marked with white lines, and there were now small boys kicking footballs across it every afternoon from 4 p.m. until the light failed. Tobena stood at the back gate some evenings and watched them with his serious face, the bowl forgotten somewhere inside. He was learning to observe first and decide later. Nobody had taught him this directly. He had learned it from the kitchen he had been raised in. Kwame asked Adaize once, on a Wednesday afternoon while she was making jollof rice and Tobena was asleep in the back room, why she had not called the police again after the first time, why she had not pursued the social welfare process more aggressively, why she had simply waited and cared for the boy and trusted that something would resolve. She turned the rice with the long wooden spoon Emmanuel had bought at Makola Market in 2011, the one she had re-oiled twice because the handle had begun to crack. She said, "I knew the work in front of me. I have always known the work in front of me. What I cannot always know is who is coming and when. So I do the work." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm grateful." She said, "I know. The rice is almost ready." Dexter Mensah thought he had removed something clean from the equation on that Thursday morning at 4:17 a.m. by leaving a 6-day-old boy on the porch of a woman he had heard mentioned once by a neighbor as reliable. He thought clean removal was possible. He had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they confuse ending a problem with ending a person's capacity to carry it. Some things cannot be taken, not by a car idling in the dark, not by a door left unopened, not by the silence that lasts 5 weeks when a government office promises 5 days. What Tobena carried was his father's name, his father's mark, the particular quality of stillness that appears in certain children when they are observing something they have already decided to understand. What Adaize carried was 31 years of knowing what a human being needs when it arrives in the world, and 27 years of knowing what a person needs when the person they loved is no longer there. And the specific capability of a woman who has learned to do the work in front of her without requiring the work to announce itself first. You cannot know, when you open a door in the dark at 4:17 in the morning, what is on the other side of it, but you can know what you carry into that moment with you, whether it is fear or whether it is the long-practiced competence of someone who has met enough of life's hardest presents to understand that the work of receiving them does not change. The people who think they are handing others a burden are sometimes, without knowing it, handing them the thing that opens everything else. Adaize kept Emmanuel's watch in the drawer beside her bed. On the night after the jet landed, she took it out and held it in her palm with the face up, the way she had done most evenings for 3 years, and the battery was still dead, and the crystal was still cracked, and the steel bracelet was still worn smooth on the inside. She set it back in the drawer beside the small wooden figure Tobena had made at his Saturday art table, a lumpy, confident shape that he had told her was a woman with a bowl, though it could have been many things. She closed the drawer. She turned off the lamp. Outside, across the flat ground that now had white lines and a fence and small boys in it every afternoon, the city continued its ordinary, extraordinary business of being a place where people arrive and wait and are received. If the women in your life who raised what the world left behind have never heard those 2 words said plainly, leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read what you have to say. Subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, hidden connections, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.